Our other speaker is Grant Swanepoel, SCOR-P, who has worked in the supply chain field for 15 years, and in this time has built credibility in the areas of sales and operations planning, demand planning, and supply chain improvement. His company, CHAINovation Africa, focuses on SCOR-based transformation learning programs and industry thought leadership projects. Over to you, gentlemen.
So sorry to interrupt this, but Grant needs to unmute himself from where he's presenting. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Thank you so much, Grant.
Was I on mute the whole time?
Yes, you were on mute the whole time.
Okay, well that's not a win so far. But let me very briefly then. All right, so maybe just to give you a quick again, just to reiterate what I just said there. So Colin, thanks for the introductions first of all. Actually, we also want to introduce Nathalie Mathys from Roche as well during this session. So she'll introduce herself in a moment. We'll give her an opportunity to do that as well. Okay. So I just went through a whole long discussion, and I know it's a rookie error to stay muted, but just to quickly reiterate that again. So we'll be taking you through this journey from a SCOR transformation point of view, looking at how the SCOR model has been used at Roche Pharmaceuticals to improve their supply chain overall. So what we'll be covering today, we'll allow Nathalie to introduce herself, and then we will be specifically looking at, from a contextual point of view, what is the clinical drug supply chain? We think it's really important that you understand that and see some of the nuances in this particular supply chain before we get into the details. We'll have a look at some of the key facts and figures around Roche specifically, and you'll see it's an extremely successful company and a massive company as well. So Roche does so much. And then we'll go into discussion on the objectives pre-SCOR implementation, in terms of what the objectives were for Roche, specifically looking at that. And then just before you reminded me that I was on mute, I just went through, wanted to discuss the metrics. So as supply chain people, it's very important that we understand the numbers and what those look like before and after an implementation like that, because this is where the benefit comes in. We'll be looking at the approach. So what was the approach taken for this project? Some of the results, which I know you want to see. Some of the key opportunities and challenges from a Roche perspective, and then we'll be discussing some of the further implementation and continuity aspects of this related to the integrated planning and the project management office. And hopefully we'll have some time for some questions as well at the very end. All right, so I know that Colin, and just to save some time as well, you've introduced myself and Douglas. Nathalie, if you could just say a few words and then tell us about yourself a little bit.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nathalie Mathys. I'm part of the PTDS organization at Roche, taking care of clinical supply chain management. And we were actually the proud winners of this year's ASCM Award for Transformation Excellence with the journey that we are going to tell you a bit more about the next minutes.
Thank you so much, Nathalie, and it's such a pleasure to have you as part of this presentation. All right, so let's go into some of the details in Roche. And Nathalie, if you could just take it away for us, give us a view of who is Roche.
Yes, no worries. I'm not going to quote all the numbers on that slide, but it's just about giving you a bit of Roche context, Roche clinical supply chain context on the pre-SCOR implementation. So we actually serve 5 key customers internally, which are research and early development, and medical affairs. In order to supply at the very end patient kits being used in clinical trials, we are managing key DP suppliers, internal and external ones. We are also sourcing comparators, and we're using also CMOs for some of the packaging activities we're doing. Within our network, we have 25 clinical depots spread all around the world to serve clinical investigator sites. We have something around 3.8 million labeled units that we pack them with 2,900 pack orders, which is leading up to actually more than 100,000 deliveries a year to serve our investigator site. And I think one thing standing out here on that slide, maybe a bit special about us, is we have a stock out target of being below 20 stock outs. And I think we're all very proud to say that so far this year, in a very challenging, unprecedented year, we have managed to go with year to date 6 stock outs. Something that is in our surrounding or outside world happening is an increased complexity of clinical trials, given all the new therapies coming up, all these new opportunities. So we are facing a 5% complexity increase a year, actually. I'm not seeing the slides anymore, but okay, let me try.
Can you see now, Nathalie?
Perfect, thank you. I was just like, I think I know that one. So actually, having talked about our customers or cleanups and early and late stage, those customers are requesting for us to prepare from a supply chain perspective their clinical trials, their studies. With that, they are giving us numbers like enrollment rates, assumptions on how the arms of the clinical trials are going to distribute. And within all processes, at the starting point, our planning organization is actually translating those assumptions into a clinical demand and supply plan. I'm again not seeing it, but it's okay, I have it. So with that, they are also planning the sourcing of the comparator products being used in some of the trials we're conducting. Along our processes, we're dealing with the standard things of material management, order preparation, and maybe a bit special and adding additional complexity, or CMO management for the DP supplies, but also for packaging and assembling for certain products. Very crucial in our processes is our master data management. That is key, that all the information across the process is smoothly flowing. Something a bit special is our label management. We are creating and designing all the labels internally, but the booklet labels, how we call them, we actually source them from label suppliers into our processes. We have our scheduling processes coming before the steps we then actually finally doing the primary and secondary packaging of our patient kits that we do within our internal sites on one side in San Francisco in the United States, as well as Kaiserauch, Switzerland. Then we're taking care of the inventory and warehouse management in our internal sites and the corresponding service logistics. And last but definitely not least, we are having our distribution and depot management on the delivery side, that they're working also with external logistics service providers. Having run through such a process successfully, we are ending up in our investigator sites where finally there is a patient participating in a clinical trial. Let me hand you over to Douglas, who gives a bit a context on why and how we went on a transformation journey with SCOR.
So good morning. I wanted to talk a little bit about the pre-SCOR objectives that were set with Roche. So I had the pleasure of working with Nathalie and the team, coaching them through the multiple efforts across the processes of plan, source, make, and deliver as we looked for opportunities to meet some of these key objectives. So anytime we enter into these projects, there already strategically are some objectives which are set for the organization, and Roche was no different. And a couple of those objectives that you see highlighted here as well. In particular, objectives around productivity. So how do we make the processes that we're working on more efficient? Looking at opportunities to remove duplications and effort, handovers between departments that may take too long, digitize certain aspects of the process as well. So really building that year-on-year increase in productivity levels. Of course, also it's very important in clinical supply trials that we also attempt to reduce the amount of lead time that is necessary in order to supply products to the laboratories and essentially then to the patients. And Roche had a very strong objective to take the existing current state lead times and reduce them by 50%. In addition to that, overall cost optimization, in particular focused around two key areas. I'm trying to bring down some of the variable costs, particularly of products. In trials, of course, you have a lot of costs associated not only with the drugs that you're entering into the trial, but also the comparator drugs. And these can also be quite expensive as you compare the results of your drug to others. And in addition to that, of course, just the immense amount of inventory, and we'll come back to this theme later, but the inventory management that's necessary to support that amazing stock out position. I mean, most of us, as Nathalie had mentioned before, would be amazed if we took a look at how efficient and how effective our operations would need to be in order to support six stockouts for the entire year. So if you're working in any business that requires stock to be on a shelf or to be at your customer at a very specific time, you can imagine the nature of the execution to make that happen. Of course, what we're hoping is that stock out objective is not met with too much inventory, because then we, of course, risk the obsolescence. In addition to that, of course, is the people side of that business and making sure that we're also having fun in the work that we do. We have a diverse work culture, and that everybody continues to have some degree of accelerated growth in their career plan. So on the onset of this journey, this is a multi-year journey. On the onset of this journey, we always had to keep these very strategic objectives in mind and ensure that the projects that we were launching were assisting in meeting those objectives. Let's talk about it in terms of some of the attributes. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the attributes associated with the projects themselves, and how some of these key, let's say, pain points or objectives kind of fit into what we think about as this collective set of attributes. And these attributes come to us from the SCOR model. So if you're familiar with those, you'll recognize the fact that the three attributes at the top of this list, reliability, responsiveness, and agility, these are attributes which tend to be more customer-facing, while the attributes of cost and asset tend to be more internal-facing. And I won't go through all of the points here relative to the Roche context, but you can see, for example, as we discussed, reliability, which of course has that key metric of what we call perfect order fulfillment, which means it needs to be on time, in full, with the correct documentation, and in perfect condition. And really having that high achievement goal on stockouts, it puts that reliability measure in very, very clear focus, so that extreme focus on avoiding any sort of patient stockouts. We already talked about the objectives around lead time, but of course, order fulfillment cycle time is the key metric associated with the responsiveness attribute. So that one, of course, was already strategically in focus for us as we attempt to avoid funding, the longer lead times with an inventory position. So shortening that lead time takes a little bit of the pressure and allows us to drain out some of that inventory. As Nathalie mentioned, this is unprecedented time. So anybody who's working at the moment will certainly the challenges of increasing or decreases of demand. So agility, of course, also in focus. On the cost side, of course, this is a process which is can be quite labor intensive, particularly around certain aspects, as Nathalie mentioned earlier, around labeling processes, etc., the critical management of the supporting master data. So this is also something which is very important for us to manage. And on the inventory side, of course, inventory as an overall cost equation in pharma is certainly, compared to development, not the biggest cost in the world, but of course what we want to do is achieve that high stockout rate at the lowest possible cost, which means we want to manage that inventory as best as possible. And we had a people side of this equation as well, where we really tended to focus on an education process. Later, when we share with you the schedule of the work that we did, you'll see that it's riddled with education and awareness throughout the organization, not just with the core team members who are working on the project, but also with others who had touch points into the project, and were maybe subject matter experts who got interviewed or a recipient of some of the output of the work that we were doing, and trying to make them more aware about how SCOR is really underlying the transformation efforts that made Roche an award-winning company. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what we call the SCOR Racetrack. And what this describes at the top here from the various 5 phases of that racetrack is the process that we go through for our transformation efforts. This is a very defined process. This is utilizing SCOR for transformation. It's known as a transformation learning program. And this is exactly the program that Roche encountered throughout the various process focuses. We first started actually with the deliver process, and then we went and we ran the racetrack again, and we did that for source and make in Kaiserhaus in Switzerland. We did it yet again for source and make for the operations in South San Francisco. We also did it for the plan operations, etc. So Roche actually ran the racetrack with a very specific process and in some cases geographic focus 4 times to try to pull through what should be the necessary projects in order to support our future state objectives. That run around the racetrack, you might first ask, is how long does that take? Most of the time, depending upon the scope of the work, most of the time, the run around the racetrack tends to be somewhere between 12 and 14 weeks. It's riddled with a series of workshops, typically 6 or 7 workshops that we go through in order to essentially deliver that final deliverable, which is a collective set of projects in a portfolio that we bring back to the leadership team and put forth our recommendations for what projects are going to take us from our current state to our future stage. And those projects in that portfolio, of course, are coupled with the roadmap of the implementation effort to get there. As you can see here, some of the projects that Roche had inside of its portfolio are very critical projects, and most of them tend to align to one or more, but most of them align to one of the supply chain level 1 processes. So you can see projects which align to plan, projects such as are the equivalent of a PSYOP process in the pharma world, which is known as CDNOP instead of SNOP, because it's clinical demand. In clinical, we don't have sales, so we call it CDNOP. You see inventory there. You see some aspects of projects related to supplier relationship management, connecting us to source. You see some improvement projects on optimizing some of our packaging operations through digitization and some label management. You see projects in deliver around things like order management on the front end and also on the back end, things like managing shelf life extensions. So all of these, not to go through all the projects, but all of these projects did actually come directly from those runs around the racetrack and manifested themselves in some key areas across the organization. Not the least of which I would say is also the enablers. So in most companies, as we continue to do transformation efforts, we find a lot of opportunity in enablement. So those sort of key things that are not fundamentally changing the processes themselves, but how those processes are enabled. Things like master data, as you can see here as well. I think also there are some key themes that also surround, generally speaking, how we bring governance to the organization. And you see some of those improvement areas on the right, making sure roles and responsibilities are clear. Everybody understands the processes, and those processes are defined in such a way to support the differentiated needs, like doing some segmentation work on the front end to make sure the processes that we're using are appropriate for the segments that we're supporting. We see some alignment around KPIs. SCOR is the perfect tool for that, as it's the definitive industry standard for defining some of those key metrics. And then, of course, anytime we're looking at improving some of our enablement, we're going to focus on the underlying IT systems, the integrations of those, and also using IT to support that aspiration around digitalization. So, again, just to summarize the approach here, it's a very formalized approach. I think Roche and others certainly appreciate the fact that it is a very defined process that we go through. We go through the racetrack first doing a lot of diagnostic work, if you will, around the processes and their disconnects, examining root causes and looking at defects in the overarching supply chain. And through that very robust analysis that we go through, we essentially deliver back that plan so that we could launch these projects into motion, which is exactly where Roche is in their journey, is having gone through the different focus areas and running that racetrack 4 times, has a great portfolio of projects now to manage. Maybe just very quickly on the next slide, just to talk a little bit about that transformation journey. I did mention this already, but it was a multi-year effort. These are not quick wins of minor improvements, right? This is really focused on true transformation opportunities. And this just highlights a little bit about the journey, right? Again, I said we focused on different process areas. We started first with doing a SCOR professional workshop. This was paramount for people to understand the SCOR model, as it's critical to the approach of transformation that we're taking. And getting people trained up on that makes them such a stronger core team participant. They feel much more knowledgeable about the work and the contribution that they're bringing to the effort. In addition to the various workshops, as I mentioned, that we run focused on different aspects of the racetrack, then we also did some onboarding training where we did a train the trainer exercise, as you can see further down in our schedule. This is referring back to that awareness piece. Again, going back and saying, okay, we're going to be touching the organization in a lot of different places through the work that we're doing within the context of the racetrack, but also as we continue to launch those projects. It's best that we continue to keep the organization informed and aware of how Roche is going to continue to manage their transformation efforts. Perhaps the last thing I'll mention on this slide is the fact that this is an ongoing journey, right? Once we have this in our DNA, once we know how to continue to do transformation, it's important that we're skilling up the organization to do this on an ongoing basis. it's for sure Roche is no different than any other company that's going to be faced with a lot of changes in their operating models for the future to meet their objectives. And it's critically important that we build that education, that foundational transformation capabilities into the organization. So let's talk a little bit about the results, and I'll turn that back over to Nathalie to discuss the successes that Roche has achieved.
Thank you very much. I think we again see the slides small. Here they are. Thank you so much. Not really stable. All right. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about what were the results of the project, and just to tell, this is just the highlights of it and the results we have been realizing so far. There is more to come, and as Douglas just mentioned, it's a journey we took on, and it's an ongoing journey. So what we did on the plan side actually is really focusing on that inventory piece. We have on one side established KPIs that they give us the right understanding of where our inventory is. And on the other side, we have made process improvements and policies put in place that they have managed, that they have enabled us to do like a 15 million inventory waste reduction just as a one-off. And for sure, there's more to come in the coming years on that. So this really is going to be a sustainable result we saw that we can leverage further benefits on in the future. And then we had that ambitious goal of 50% lead time reduction that we have managed on the plant side to achieve for make-to-order packaging. We have improved our CDNOP processes, actually now really enabling us to see like challenges ahead well in advance and to be able to take educated decisions on how we want to address those challenges. On the source make side, we have been implementing the lead time KPIs that is showing us insights on where we have what cycle times actually, where we see areas for improvement, and also being an enabler to us to actually understand if the projects really deliver the results we were aiming for with them, and to see where we can start new things to further drive it down. We've also been extensively working on our supplier relationship management structures and implemented a routine with all of our suppliers, which has been leading in a 20% on-time delivery to commit improvement, which of course gives us great benefits on the reliability of our sourcing process, and consequently helps us stabilizing our internal processes a lot. On the delivery side, we've also seen tremendous lead time reduction on the cycle time side of minus 23% compared to before we started. And I think one piece that the colleagues are really proud of, and we are really proud of, is that we have been able to reduce landfill by 50% by using reusable shippers, which was one of the projects we have been starting on that transformation journey. Integrating with our third parties on the IT systems, of course, has smoothened out information exchange and granted great transparency we can use that are enablers for the big benefit on further cycle time reductions in our distribution network. And as Douglas mentioned, enable should not be underestimated. So having had a master data governance in place now, where we really understand who is responsible for a data field, who is providing that information, who is allowed to change it and not, is granting a lot of clarity, is streamlining a lot of discussions and uncertainties in our processes. Using a SCOR balanced scorecard gives us a quick reference overview of where we stand, where we need to act, how things are going well. And then also the training of the trainers that Douglas introduced is really key, because it does not help us only to maintain the knowledge within our organization around the SCOR reference model, but also allows us to welcome new people and onboard them immediately on the SCOR reference model when joining our organization. And then, having run that many projects, also having had other projects coming up on the capability side that we have to develop, building like a project management office structure, helping us to understand the dependencies of our projects, the benefits, and also building a baseline for prioritization has been a huge benefit for us. Next one, maybe. Yeah, well, going through such a transformation process actually brings on opportunities, also some challenges, but I would really say largely opportunities. So this is just like highlights the key focus areas, but what was really impressive going through the SCOR accelerators was how many blind spots we could detect, how many unaddressed issues came up by following through the systematic value stream mapping approach in the accelerator workshops, but also having had structured interviews with subject matter experts across the organization. And I think one big advantage of these workshops is really you identify hundreds of opportunities, but within that workshop, you also focus on understanding what are the benefit and efforts of those one to realize them, and you're actually prioritizing them directly while you're going through your racetrack that I really went through 4 times, by the way. And well, one of the big opportunities for us being clinical supply chain management was that having this structure and the SCOR framework really helped us like understanding that, yes, we are clinical, but we are not that different. So this does not mean we cannot use standardized KPIs, standardized processes, following industry best practices. And I think here a key advantage was really also to have had Douglas with his great expertise and the multi-year experience, that he was able to give us kind of the confidence of is working in other companies as well, is working in other areas as well, is really stable, is going to fly. So it really helped us a lot to change the mindset that, yes, we are special, but we do not have always and everywhere need to be that special as we might were. And then definitely something that needs to be considered is don't go alone. This accounts on one side for key customers and suppliers, because wanting to improve interface processes is very important to have them on board. But on the other side is really also an advantage going with external facilitation and expertise, as it, of course, on one side, it creates a certain objectiveness. It allows, with the structure we're going through and the focus you're giving, to go on a high speed through these racetracks. And on the other side, it also puts puts the importance of it to the people. It shows that this is really a focus, that we really want to do that professionally, and that we really want to go for a big transformation and not just a small continuous improvement initiative. Then one thing that I believe it was really key and a key success factor is that we took the people along, so everyone was part of that journey. So it started with the training on what is SCOR, granting that everyone has a baseline understanding of supply chain management principles, but also really being part of a solution generation. It took out a lot of resistance, and it actually was increasing the ownership that people felt for then actually going and delivering out what we have been putting our targets and what we wanted to have as results out of it. And then, like, one recommendation we would definitely give is, yes, we went through 4 racetracks, but it was worth it. It really is important to cover all the aspects of the SCOR reference model, like with the plan, source, make, and deliver, as well as enable, because everything is interconnected and everything goes together, and it's really bringing up so great collaboration opportunities, breaking down silos opportunities. if you go through all the areas. One learning we had is that one should do plan first, as plan is applicable everywhere. We plan our deliveries, we plan our sourcing, we plan our packaging. So planning really integrates with everything. It has so many linkages. And having this being first would be an advantage, as sometimes you do not have to wait or keep a question mark open as you're waiting for a plan on going through that racetrack and doing their systematic analysis and finding their opportunities as well.
Thank you so much for that, Nathalie. And just to finish off on the implementation and continuity of the project. So what the SCOR transformation program leaves the organization with is a set of projects and a roadmap in terms of the implementation of the projects. But the organization still needs to implement the project, right? And that's where the real value comes in doing something like this, is actually in the implementation and the change that happens because of it. So as Nathalie just mentioned, there's a big component to this related to planning. And there was a lot of discussions, I know in some of the sessions that I joined, where the link back into plan or the link into the control tower was very key in terms of making sure that everything works well together. So as you heard a moment ago, the CHAINovation, which is their version of a PSYOP or an S&OP process, needed to start to link to everything. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the detail of this, but just to show you the complexities that were found by going through this whole process and looking at the different themes that came up. So we look at things like long-range forecasting and forecasting. For example, how does that send triggers to other parts of the business, and how do we need to integrate that? Segmentation, or looking at the different types of supply chains that exist within the clinical drug supply chain. The interaction with the customer, which is ClinOps in their case. And then looking at metrics. I mean, of course, we know very important is to measure what we do. And then obviously there's an overall governance step that needs to take place, which actually form part of a key project. And then just really quickly to finalize this from a project management point of view is what Roche determined was that there was a very strong need to ensure that all those projects get managed so that we do see the benefits of those. And the one that I'd like to focus on here is the fourth diamond there, which is the benefits and cost tracking. So how do we understand the benefits that's coming from each of these projects? Are they measured? And are they managed effectively? And actually, we're seeing the benefit of those. And that's very key to ensuring that this does actually work well, as well as all these other pieces of the puzzle. So the team implemented a PMO, or project management office, using smart sheets to facilitate the process. So there were people assigned to it. There was a monthly cycle, and there was various different dashboards and ways to manage that entire process. And by the way, this is all still ongoing. So a couple of projects have been completed, but there are still a number of projects in the total Roche portfolio that are actually ongoing and are still yielding benefits as they go. All right, so thank you so much, everyone. We've got a couple of minutes left, I think about 5 or 6 minutes left. And I wonder if there are any questions. I can't see the questions, so maybe Colin or someone else from the team could maybe just let us know if there are any questions there.
Let me have a look, Grant. Wow, under the discussion. Well, first let's look in Q&A. Yep, we have something here. Quite a bit of reading for me to do.
So Colin, before you start with the question, just to quickly let everyone know. So Douglas will be available in the CHAINovation Africa booth directly after this session, right? So we will be on for a couple more minutes for any additional questions if we don't get to everything here. Just so everybody knows. The CHAINovation Africa booth, if you go into that booth, you will find us there.
So we have a question from Andre. Thanks for the presentation. Good highlights thus far. That said, Roche is a large firm. A few questions arises, Douglas. 1, how do you go about digesting the scope of issues to address at Roche? I suspect that this takes the average person months. Number 2, it is difficult to execute on time in full across hundreds of SKUs. How do you go about implementing on time in full for thousands of SKUs at Roche? I assume that this was a goal. Number 3, it seems to me, from what you said, Douglas, the phases were educate, integrate, synchronize, then optimize. Is this assumption correct? I hope you're taking notes, Doug. Number 4, finally, it seems to me that there are only 4 to 6 key items that need addressing in most firms, and not to say 170 items, because the residual is simply an effect and not the cause. So I think Andre would like Doug to answer.
Okay, great. Let me just make sure first, as we take a stab at answering some of those very insightful questions, Andre. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let me just take a stab at some of those initial questions, Andre, that you put forward. So I think the first one was really about how do we go about digesting the scope? And so, Grant, if you could actually go back to the Racetrack slide, I'd like to take that Racetrack and talk through that a little bit. So that define stage in the Racetrack is all about addressing the scope. So you're absolutely correct in terms of what issues we want to try to address. What we're trying to take a look at in that initial scoping discussion, but also the analysis that follows is yes, absolutely, we have to focus on the critical elements that are really driving what we call the defects in performance or the disconnects associated with the process. So that really becomes, if you kind of think about it this way, and you alluded to it to the third part of your question there, which is really about understanding the contribution of some of those defects to the overall process. Because not all of them have the same contributions. And of course, what we want to try to do is get down to the ones that we think are really impacting the performance. And through this, what we call the defect analysis, kind of the similar way in which we might do in a Lean Six Sigma process around the 5 whys, is to really break that down and say, okay, this is a major impacting factor to the performance. This is really contributing to some of the process disconnects. And in that, it kind of goes back to the second part of your question there is in and around OTIF, et cetera, is the fact that in addition to understanding the contributions of different impacts in terms of order fulfillment cycle time or OTIF, that's on time in full portion of perfect order fulfillment, is when we do the root cause analysis there, what we're trying to do is understand not only the average performance across this multitude of SKUs, as you said, like thousands of SKUs, but on the SKUs is taking a look at also the variability in that performance. And because I always caution about the fact that we can easily get lost in this world of averages. And what we see is, for example, on OTIF or on order fulfillment cycle time, that we're essentially running the same process, but the output of that process is very variable, right? Sometimes we can do it in this lead time, and other times we can do it in this lead time. It's a similar customer, we're manufacturing a similar product, etc. Why do we see these variabilities? And being able to stabilize that process is very critical to driving some of that improvement. You also asked about the phases.
Maybe to add on the OTIF.
Yes,
can
please,
I add on the
Natalie, go
OTIF?
ahead.
Yes, because I think one thing to clarify is it wasn't like we didn't have any data before. Douglas actually said, okay, we're data rich, but the insights poor. So we already had a lot of data. So what was it about? It was basically making sure that we're using industry standard practices on how we define those KPIs, how they are in the end going to be calculated, also enabling us into the benchmarking. And of course, like the side of being a large firm has a challenge of might having a lot of SKUs, but it also has the advantages that you can be supported by your systems in collecting that data. And when we went through that with Douglas, we actually did not only ask the question of what is the right way, what is the right definition of that KPI and how can we fulfill it, but also where is this data coming from and how can we make sure that the measurement actually is working largely, if not fully automated. So otherwise, if we would do that kind of cumbersome, this would be really overwhelming. So there were things there. We had to just kind of get it on the right level.
Great. Thank you, Nathalie. That's great. And then, and maybe Nathalie, you want to chime in on this one as well, which is, I'll take maybe a stab at the final portion of your question, where you asked the question about making the statement, and then the question about there may be only 4 to 6 items that need addressing in most firms, not 170. Yeah, it's going to be somewhere in the mix of that. Grant, if we can go to maybe the slide, again, the Racetrack slide, which had the projects that came out of it. One thing I maybe want to remind is going through this transformation journey and developing this collective set of projects. And each time we went around the Racetrack, perhaps there were 5 or 6, or maybe in some instances, I think the largest we had was 9 projects that ended up in the portfolio. One of the things we have to be very careful of, and Nathalie alluded to it earlier, is there's a lot of improvement efforts that are already happening and underway as we start the journey of the transformation learning program. So when we develop the portfolio at the end of that run around the Racetrack, what we have to ensure ourselves is that if there's anything that seems connected to the project that we're developing, one of 2 things needs to happen. We need to either take this improvement opportunity that may already be in motion and embed it into the project that we're developing as a part of this portfolio, or the other way around. We need to take the improvement opportunity that we uncovered through the journey and make sure that informs the existing effort which is already underway. And going back to what Grant mentioned earlier, once we put those pieces of that puzzle together, it's not 5 or 6 probably, but it's certainly not 170. But the roadmap for the transformation incorporates not only what we found throughout the various journeys and what we developed in terms of those portfolio projects, but it also fully included the existing improvement opportunities which are already in motion. So everything that we're trying to do as an organization is now self-contained in terms of those projects. So that, I think, is also very important. So we don't end up with this, and what you might be alluding to, Andre, is that, sometimes you have so many projects, you end up with project fatigue, and your organization gets lost on the direction, and they get fatigued with the effort because it seems like we're trying to change so many things. The construct of that inset of portfolio of projects, the amount of projects that exist within it, are going to be crucial to ensuring that the transformation effort actually gets done.
And maybe to add on that, I think like running through a transformation, you still have to fulfill like your daily business, right? So you cannot just do transformation. And this also was one part of our project management office to really ensure that we are prioritizing with respect to the resources we have, with respect to the importance of certain aspects to be delivered earlier than later, understanding the dependencies in between them. So we understood what has to go first, what can wait, if there was a need to actually maybe pause it for a little bit until we could free up resources from another project delivering benefits and then reinvest them into a new one. So even though it might were not 170, I think still it's always important to prioritize and not overwhelm the organization.
Okay, I think we're going to have to call it a day there because we've run out of time. I'd like to remind the audience, first of all, before you leave the presentation, please click on polls, on the button marked polls on the right, and please give an evaluation for this presentation. 1 is poor and 5 is good, is excellent. And another reminder is from SAPIX, is that there is a very exciting quiz competition going to be held tonight this afternoon at, I think, 16:45. But just check on your programs, and everybody's invited to that. So finally, to Nathalie, and to Douglas, and to Grant, thank you very much. for a very interesting case study on the implementation of SCOR principles. And thank you very much for taking the trouble and presenting to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great day to everyone.